Hello, I'm Chris Slisher, and welcome to Turning of the Wheel, an intelligent, lively discussion about astrology, art, and spiritual adventure. Timing is everything, and as the great wheel turns, we are best prepared when we are best informed. Join me as I explore concepts that allow us to broaden our view of the world. You'll hear interesting topics, meet fascinating guests, and discover who you really are. Using the time-tested practices of astrology, you'll learn how to accept change as the great wheel of life turns. Astrology, art, and spiritual adventure on Turning of the Wheel TV with Chris Slisher. Hello and welcome to Turning of the Wheel. My name is Chris Slisher. As you know, this is a show about astrology, primarily about astrology, but I also delve into art and spiritual adventure sometimes as well, which allows me to cast a very wide net of esoteric metaphysical topics, which I love, and we're going to have some great shows coming up. But today, we're going to be speaking about the prediction quality of astrology. And most people, believe it or not, I think turn to astrology because they want to know what the future, what's going to be in the future. Well, am I going to get a new job? Am I going to get a baby? Am I going to get married? Many of my clients will come to me with those kinds of questions. They want to know what the future is. And this is a time-tested practice of astrology, and it's one that goes back centuries where people have always wanted to know what's going to happen. That's part of the reason people turn to astrologers, but it's also part of the reason astrologers get a bad rap, because sometimes we're not accurate. We can't tell you to buy a lottery ticket on Tuesday, but money may be in your future. So I've invited my good friend Tad Mann to come on today, and we're going to be speaking about this topic, which is, can astrology predict? So welcome to Turning the Wheel, Tad. Great to have you on.
Thanks, Chris.
Tad is a very highly regarded astrologer, from widely regarded across the world. He's written numerous books on astrology. His website is atman.net, double N, and I encourage you to go there. He's an astrologer, he's an author, he's an artist, he's an architect, and you'll see in his work where all of these things coalesce and create a very unusual, spectacularly stunning coalition of ideas and thoughts. But astrology is one of his main avenues of knowledge. And so, you know, when you think about it, and you've been studying astrology for ages, when someone comes to you and asks you that question, do you think astrology is an accurate predictor?
Yes. It's very controversial, in fact, these days. Actually, since the 70s, which is when I began practicing astrology professionally, because there are many psychological astrologers, in quote, and they tend to look at astrology as being a kind of personality study.
Right.
And many of them claim that they don't predict. I think that's actually a little wacky, because we do obviously look at it mainly, and at least partially, because of the fact that it gives us some sense of where we're heading. Mm-hmm. And the type of astrology I developed back in the 70s is called lifetime astrology. And the gist of it is that I look at a person's chart as a whole pattern of their lifetime, beginning at conception and going to the birth moment, through gestation, through childhood, maturity, and on ahead into the future. In fact, in most charts, you can see essentially the trajectory of people's lives through time. And according to where those planets register around the wheel, it actually shows when in life major influences tend to happen. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because I began realizing in the very beginning that in order to understand where you're going, it's actually very necessary to understand where you've been. Right. So I began realizing that a lot of these early influences, like your parents' relationship, because in astrology the sun is your father in the very beginning and the moon is your mother. Gradually, as you age, the sun becomes other men and the man in you and the spiritual part of you and so on, just as the moon becomes not only your mother, but actually any woman in your life, the nurturing part of you and so on. So the idea is that the early dynamics that come into being during gestation when your mother carries you, which are often projections and very deep projections about, you know, my child's going to run the world, or my child's going to be an artist like me, or whatever those natural projections are, as well as the birth process itself, which is like a coming out into the world in a way, and then early childhood, which of course was what's the area of life that Freud centered on as being
the formative years.
Really the formative period when your emotional body and the basic emotional patterns come into being through your home and family system. I began realizing that astrology is a perfect vehicle for describing these things because it's essentially cyclical.
It's cyclical.
Meaning that if you have this overall life pattern, then planets like, for example, like the moon goes around, I mean, there's a lunar eclipse in 2 days, but the moon essentially goes around the entire chart of your whole lifetime every month. The sun every year. Jupiter does it in 12 years. So the idea is that we're always reiterating and reliving through the events that populate our life. And of course, vis-a-vis prediction, a lot of people's charts I looked at, maybe they were 20 years old or 25 or 30, I'd see that there were planets registering when they were in their 40s or 50s or 60s. Well, I have to talk about them, and in fact, they represent predictions.
Right.
They represent, and people want to know, and I gradually developed the technique so that in talking about where you were going, that it incorporated clues that come from where you've been. Because you can't take it out of context.
Right.
And the problem with traditional astrology is it's very timeless in a very weird way, because astrology is about time. So once you take into consideration the fact that these later patterns have aspect combinations to the earlier patterns, aspects simply connect events in your life at different ages to each other, or different kind of behavioral patterns, that you can begin to have a very good idea, not necessarily to say you're going to do this, but rather these are the kind of patterns you're likely to bring into being. Right. These are the options. These are the available range of possibilities that can happen at that stage.
And that's the critical piece to remember, is the range of possibilities. Because I think that when we look at astrology, people do want that precision. They want to know, what's going to happen next week? We can't give that precision. We might be able to give you an idea, a flavor of a theme that you're going to be in. I've always used the idea of a theme. I think it's kind of like playing the game Clue. A certain point in time, events are going to line up that bring you into a room of a house that allows that theme to occur. And those themes are based on, I usually use the outer planets. I use Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto to give you those long-term themes. So as you say, you may see a chart of somebody who's 20 years old and say when you're 40, you may have this great awakening or this may happen to you. We can get a very crisp idea of what's going on, but we're not going to tell you to buy a lottery ticket on Tuesday.
Right, well, and so the whole idea of it is that my clients over time, having done this professionally for 44 years or whatever it is, that what they really want and what they can really use is it's valuable for them to know when particular parts of their being are in the process of being triggered again.
Right.
Like, for example, if you had a very difficult birth, which means, maybe your mother had a C-section, or that,
premature.
It was, like Saturn on the ascendant means of long labor. And that means that any time in your life when the ascendant gets triggered, you're likely to be birthing something. You're birthing some part of you. It might be birthing a film or a book or a new child or a new job or whatever that happens to be. The whole idea is it's very valuable to know that because your birth itself took a long time and a lot of labor to actually work through, that you're likely to experience something like that, meaning you might experience a bit of depression. You might feel that you want to go through it quickly, but yet it just seems to be taking forever. So by being able to identify the primary qualities that are coming into being, as well as when someone has an accurate birth time, or if you use lifetime astrology, then you have a pretty good idea when these phases are likely to come into being, when they're likely to reach their peak, and then when they're likely to leave a residue. So.
Right. It's really accurate because we've always used this analogy of time being a helios. It's the giant corkscrew of time that goes around, and events do recur at a certain place in time, but they're down the road further in a different place in time, a different scene, because time is like a river. It's a continuum. And in that continuum, you may have an event when you're 12 years old that's tied to the Jupiter transit, and then when you turn 24, you're in a similar theme. It may be a rebirth, as you said. You may have, you may be graduating and going into junior high and you're on the soccer team when you're 12 years old. And then 24, you may have been graduating or getting your master's degree. And you'll have these major significant I would say in case of Jupiter, they would tend to be more auspicious than not, but
That's right.
you know, so we tend to think of it that way. But those themes are there, and it is about the idea of the passage of time.
Well, yeah, as you know, I mean, I've talked about this before on your program, but the whole genesis of this lifetime astrology technique that I developed is really based around a very simple phenomenon, which interestingly was speculation back in the 70s, but which is now being acknowledged by lots of major physicists, for example, which is that our sun isn't just sitting in space with planets moving around it. Rather, it's moving at 1,000,000 miles a day around the center of the galaxy, and it makes a very complex nested pattern of spirals. And my postulate back in those days was that the spiral solar system echoes the structure of the DNA molecule in every single cell in your body. So not only is it something that's happening, you know, no one really knows what the mechanism of astrology is, but my postulate is that there's a resonance in physics. Resonance means any two patterns that have a similar form and a similar geometry and a similar structure basically exchange information. So what happens is that spiraling pattern, you know, we're not just going around in a circle in our life. We're part of a very complex spiral, and as a result, a Jupiter event happening when you're in your mother's womb may mean that she's putting on a lot of weight. Right. You know, when it happens in your childhood, it may mean that your uncle gives you a bicycle to play with or for your birthday. When you're in college, you may earn honors. The point is that similar events are happening, but because of the way astrology works, you can actually talk about the likely manifestation of Jupiter at each stage of your life process, and it's going to be different.
It's going to be different.
So we go through the same processes, however, to have some sense of how you might utilize it. And again, the issue is that one thing you can't predict is that some people internalize the whole process, and it's part of our function as astrologers to recognize, are you likely to experience these things in your inner life, or are you likely to or want to express it in the outside world?
And that is where the real true value of astrology comes in, I think, is because it does require the outside objectivity, intervention as well, of an outsider who is well versed in interpretation to be able to collate these facts and figures into a spot where you get an accurate picture. Because of the simple fact that we are moving around the sun, and the sun is moving at the same time, we are never in the same place at any time. Time is always a continuum.
We can't be.
But the influence and the predictability of recurring patterns amongst the planets in any person's charts do, without question, point to accuracy with regard to the themes of where, and this is where the idea of knowing when to hold and when to fold is really the most accurate analogy for that time, because if you've got Jupiter coming across your midheaven, meaning your house of career, and you're not doing something to boost your career, you're missing a very valuable opportunity.
Right.
And so it's when and it's not just Jupiter. We refer to Saturn. Your Saturn return happens at 28, 29. Almost everybody I know either leaves home, gets married, gets pregnant, buys a house or something in that time frame, and then again at 58, 59. So these are...
Well, the irony about it, in which one of the most interesting aspects of it is that people who have difficult gestations, like the mother and father aren't married, or there are difficulties, or there are difficulties in childhood, or parents divorce, and the blockages that show up in people's lives, ironically, are typically more powerful in the horoscopes of the more creative people.
Yes.
So people who have difficult issues when they're young are actually always reliving these same principles, and by showing them what these really connect back to, in a way, what it allows them to do is to utilize that as the raw material to make their creativity from. Like an interesting example is I did a chart, I don't know, a couple of years ago for an incredibly creative person whose difficulty was that she would actually learn particular ways of being creative, and when it came to actually expressing it, she would freeze or collapse or not be able to really bring it out.
Yeah.
And so she'd start something all over again. So I discovered she has Neptune on the ascendant. Neptune means, on the ascendant, which is your birth moment, means that at the moment her mother was about to deliver her, the doctor gave her an anesthetic. And it stopped that peristaltic action, is the the rhythm of life, and
which
the
was
rhythm,
common back then.
which pushes you out of the womb. And so what happened is that Neptune meant that whenever she passed the ascendant and was about to birth something in her, she froze.
She was lost in,
So
a sense
by
of
simply
delusion.
her knowing that and recognizing it, it allowed her to begin to realize, aha, that's what's happened.
Right.
So in a way, it's not that it cured the problem, but it actually allowed her to know enough about it, about the metaphor of it, to recognize that she could go have some therapy, she could do rebirthing, she could really begin to learn that this is something that she needs to push through, because guess what? Her mother did push her through eventually.
This is one of the most incredibly valuable pieces of astrology as a counseling tool is what you just mentioned. It's being able to discover what I would call the attributes and the liabilities that are in the chart. We are all born with a set of attributes, which are our talents, which are things that come easy to us, but we're also given a set of liabilities that are difficult. Those are symbolized by the squares. And if a good astrologer recognizes this, they will say, listen, you are in a time of challenge. You're climbing a stair, which is just a 90-degree angle. You see them everywhere you go. And when you're climbing a stair, you're going up a ladder. Yes, it is difficult to climb that challenge, but that is where the real, true creativity comes. There's not a single famous person in the world who doesn't have a difficult chart or difficult aspects in it, because it's that function, that tension, that forces them to create and surmount those hardships. Winston Churchill. Perfect example, was horrendously shy as a child, and yet went on to become an incredible orator. And he's the one that actually used that same quote about, we don't know where we're going until we know where we've been.
Right, and the thing is that these principles become really powerful. Like, for example, the sun and the moon, if they're your father and mother, and there's no aspect between them early on, then it basically means your parents are not really connected to each other. In fact, they may decide to have you because they think of you as being what connects them.
What holds them together, yeah.
What can hold them together. But what we know is, as far apart as they can be, that they did manage to come together because you're here sitting in front of me.
Well, that could have been a moment of gay, reckless abandon.
So it may have been, and if so, that could be a key to your creativity.
Right.
So the point is that you know, because someone's there, and that they have been conceived and gestated and birthed, that, you know, every one of us who are here and alive in this moment are essentially a successful experiment.
Right, very
It's
successful,
interesting
because the odds are really against you.
You know, and when you look at people's charts, you know, and look at the whole lifetime flow, you see these patterns really becoming very significant. Like, you know, I read recently, there was a major article in the New Yorker about Goethe, the famous German philosopher,
Poet, right, yeah.
Statesman, poet, who was just one of the most creative people. And it's interesting because when he was born, Saturn was right on his ascendant, which meant, and in fact, he was stillborn. They thought that he was dead at birth. So they actually even went through the process of thinking that he was going to die,
Yeah.
and he survived. So at the exact opposite point in my system, when he's 23 on the descendant, he wrote a novel in his early 20s called The Death of Young Werther, which was about a frustrating death of a young man who felt like he'd never make it in the world. And so this was a repetition of the near death of his birth, and it made his reputation.
Wow. See, so that character.
So this problem ended up being a key and a clue to his entire creative life process.
Right. And that was a character stamp, you could say. That was an imprint. That was a character attribute that he was born with, which then allowed him to become the man he was. Would he have become that had he not had that? I would argue that he probably would not. He probably would be just some, you know, a wheat farmer in Tuscany or who knows where. But the fact of the matter was that he wasn't that. He was that person who had that characteristic, and he rose to, and he fulfilled that challenge. And that is the secret of astrology. When you find these, and this is why it's so brilliant when we see these charts of people, fascinating as they are phenomenally rich with character, and it's in that difficulty, that challenge, which we astrologers refer to as squares or oppositions, or even conjunctions for that matter, where you see the seed of genius and the seed of creativity.
Well, it's fascinating, actually, you know, to be honest, that it can also be extremely frustrating. For example, when I developed this whole system, I was in my late 20s. And I see in my chart a whole combination of powerful Jupiter, Pluto influences happening in my mid-70s.
Yeah.
And I thought to myself, does that mean I've got to wait 45 years for this to really
Well-
mature itself? And actually, as it turns out, it looks very much like that pattern is coming true. And part of it is that, eighth house qualities, which is these later planets in life often, mean things like astrology is not really taken seriously in the world. However, I really believe that that's going through a major change.
I do
really
too.
believe that some of these core principles, and particularly ones that I was able to identify 45 years ago, are being embraced by psychologists, by
Yes,
people who
absolutely.
study gestation, by embryologists, and the whole point being that I really believe that astrology needs a reevaluation by
Absolutely.
the academic world in
Absolutely.
such a way that I think we have a lot to bring to the value of how our lives develop, and that
It's
I think
amazing.
a lot of psychologists use it, a lot
do.
of doctors use it, a lot of therapists use it, and so on.
I mean, if you think in some ways, those of you who are familiar with this, there's a personality test called Myers-Briggs. Myers-Briggs is nothing more than a variation of what astrology can bring to the table. If I were to tell you that the majority, if I were to look at my client base of people who come to me for counseling, if I were to tell you that the majority of the one type of occupation that stands out in that range of clients, it's psychologists, social workers, hospice workers, people who are seekers, people who have an idea. This is what proves that astrology works. You can put an astrologer and a psychologist together, and you will find that they will have a jump start on the character of their clients. It's remarkable. There is such wealth of information there that cannot be
Yeah,
denied.
and because we're all subject to those cycles, we all live our lives that way,
Mm-hmm.
and we, people varyingly look back or look forward, but the whole idea is by placing you in time, in your own story. I mean, I literally, in one of my first books, I called the way I do readings, Your Story, because it's interesting because you look back on it when you're a little older, as I feel like I am right now, and you realize that this has been an incredibly long, complex, weird story that's flip-flopped, that's moved
Yeah,
all over the
yeah,
place.
yeah.
And of course, by reiterating people's stories and really showing them that they've played a whole cast of characters, and that I now look at a planet that shows up in a predictive reading as being a messenger.
Yes.
It's like a Saturn person shows up in your life who's very restrictive and very confining. It's like a message saying, aha, I need to be a little more careful, a little more serious, a little more structured.
A little more responsible.
So it's like, and all of these messengers are very valuable to us if we really can learn to identify.
They are, and interesting. I think that I always refer to the astrology chart as an owner's manual. So it's sort of like your instructions are there in the manual when you're born. You give it to somebody. I got somebody who was just born on March 20th the other day, and I saw this chart and I said, "Wow, this person's going to be a powerhouse when they get to be older." It's so obvious. It jumps right out at you. But what you mentioned about the timing of you being able to see in your own chart when you were going to succeed, I think that's very evident in a wide range of people. And I always use the examples, as I was speaking earlier, Michael Jackson. Michael Jackson, he was 5 years old, and he's on the Ed Sullivan Show dancing up a storm with his brother, world famous at 5 years old. And then you look at the other extreme, someone like George Bernard Shaw, famous English author, didn't get his first book published till he was 94. Now granted, those are extremes, but many of us fall somewhere in between in that range, and that is based on where the incidence of the planets are, the importance of them, and how they line up in your charts as being accurate. And your timing is there. So in that regard, astrology is accurate. Astrology is a predictor of that kind of quality, much the way we can apply it to the mundane. And when we refer to the word mundane, we don't mean boring. We refer to the world as a whole. So all the world is responds to an event. Typically when eclipses happen, or typically when big planetary alignments happen, we see major changes happening on this world stage. And we saw that with the Pluto-Uranus square that we're going through right now. The United States political system is totally being revamped. There's revolution across the globe. So we saw this years and years and years ago, didn't we?
Absolutely. I mean, these, once you begin to understand the whole dynamic of this, it doesn't mean you have to do something at a given time, but a lot of people feel more comfortable being aware of the fact that these cycles happen, and that, it's what's interesting is when clients come to me every year for an update, year after year after year, whether they know much about astrology at all or not, they begin learning. They begin really discovering a deeper layer of their own patterns, their own feelings, their own way of doing things, and it really does have a very helpful factor, or it becomes a helpful factor in how they run their lives.
It certainly does.
And they don't feel constrained by it. Rather, they feel that this is a great clue, and I'm really pleased to have it.
Well, it's validating. You know, if you're going through difficult times in your life, and it's evident in the chart through the timing of the chart and the coincidence of the aspects, I find that to be validating. I think there's a certain amount of time. There's a way that you can look at it. You can say things are changing, and as a result of that change, you can adapt accordingly. And I think that that ability to adapt is remarkably rich with regard to timing. And it's by the same token, if you're in a spot where things are good, you want to be able to maximize that. You know, I had a client once who came on who had just gotten laid off, and yet Jupiter was moving into her 10th house. I asked her what she was doing. She says, oh, I'm sitting around the house collecting unemployment. I says, get yourself a new hairdo, buy a new suit, get your resume touched up, and get out there. And she did. And within 6 months, she had a fabulous job. That probably would not have happened had she not acted at that time. That's why that phrase, knowing when to hold and when to fold, is really what a predictive astrology is all about.
Yeah, and I think also that you learn through time. I mean, astrology in the beginning is really an amazing system of correspondences.
Correspondence.
And what I mean by that is that the color red's associated with Mars, and it's associated with anger or desire, or, you know, if you wear a red shirt, then it means you're manifesting Aries qualities or Mars qualities, and that the colors and the symbols and the ways of acting and the ways of being and the times of the year, which we just entered actually 2 days ago, and so on, you know, that once you begin to see all of these symbols coming together, then you begin actually checking out that there's a communication going on in your life in the world, and that you can spot particular qualities and know that because this particular person's wearing a red shirt, they're likely to be irritated today.
Right.
You know, or they want to be the center of attention.
They want to draw attention.
So don't take it away. You know, don't take it away from them.
Exactly. So when you think about it, when people who subscribe to newsletters or subscribe to any sort of thing like that, there is a correlation between what's happening and how it applies to you. If you know specific parts of your individual astrology chart, it can be incredibly helpful with regard to how you granulate that kind of information. So I always refer to people, I say, read your sun sign and read your rising sign. Put the two of those together, and then if you can't, throw your moon in there. When you get those 3 data points, you're going to get much closer to the theme that's happening that month, that day, that year. Now, if you don't know that, you can contact Tad at his website, atman.net. There it is on the screen, or you can contact me at turningofthewheel.com and get that information. It's important that you know your birth time. You know your birth time, you can determine the ascendant. When you know the ascendant, you can read that, and you're going to get some very clear accuracy with regard to what's happening in your life. And it's critical because it is about being in the right place at the right time. I think if you look back over your life, you'll find yourself in the right place at the right time.
You'll particularly find yourself where you are.
No matter where you go, there you are.
That's right.
Yeah, it's really remarkable. I want to again thank Tad for coming on today. We got a little bit of time here left. Tad is an astrologer. Primarily, he's an artist, he's an architect. He actually got his background as an architect, and I found more astrologers or architects than any other trade that I've been able to find. So I find that to be a fascinating, because it's the correlation of degrees and angles which brings it all together. His website is atman.net. I encourage you to go there. His books are fabulous. I'm a huge fan of his stuff. So it's been great to have you on, Tad. Thanks so much for coming by and talking. And we're going to do some more talks later down the road about a different topic. So thanks so much, and we'll talk to you all on the next episode. And thanks for watching.